Pekka here with Drew and Andrew Chakhoyan. I hope I didn't slaughter the name. Maybe Drew, any words here at this point?
I just apologize to everyone. I'm looking after two dogs, so that's why I've got them in the podcast. But no, it's so good to meet you, Andrew. It's good to meet a fellow Drew slash Andrew, and it's good to talk. I know you've been doing really good work on Ukraine. So yeah, no, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being here.
So Andrew, can you introduce yourself? Who you are? What do you love to do? What kind of soup do you like?
My favorite soup is vatnik soup, of course. There's no better one out there. It's amazing to join your podcast. I've seen your work over the years, your support for Ukraine. It's for me, it's obvious. I grew up in Ukraine, Ukrainian American, now in the Netherlands, but I just love seeing folks whose story is not directly connected to Ukraine stand up and speak the truth, right? It's so much more obvious to be on the side of truth, and it's confusing for why it's not obvious to people that argue the other side. But thank you both, and like Drew said, it's nice to meet a namesake.
No, thank you, man. Thank you.
But can you briefly outline your work? What do you do? You are Ukrainian, right?
Yeah, so maybe to sum up my career in one word, it's diplomacy. I've done diplomacy of all kinds. I Ukrainian American with Armenian, Jewish, Ukrainian roots. Grew up in east of Ukraine. My hometown's been occupied for over a decade. I was born in Donetsk. Grew up next door in Horlivka, but I've immigrated to the U.S. in '98. So I've spent more time now outside of Ukraine than in Ukraine, and I lived in Utah of all places, in the middle of America, in East Coast, DC, Boston. Worked in the U.S. government. I served as an American diplomat, working on international development programs in Moldova, Armenia, Ghana, different places, Mongolia. Then moved to Europe, spent time in Switzerland, and then now moved to the Netherlands. And so, in my spare time, I teach a course at the University of Amsterdam on multilateralism, and Ukraine is featured in it as a manifestation of this question of how do we as humanity, how do we get things right, how do we collaborate towards shared goals. But yeah, like another thing that I spend my spare time on is writing and spending time on Twitter, dealing with Russian lies, the endless Russian lies.
What do you think is the most effective Russian lie when it comes to social media? What is the most what works the best? The best.
I think it's the quote from Goebbels that comes to mind is accuse your your enemy of what you're guilty of. It's done every single day. The projection is unbelievable. It's so obvious, but for whatever reason it works. It's go back to invasion of eastern Ukraine. The Russian story would be Ukrainians are bombing themselves. It's like it's so obvious that it's a lie, yet that's the way it's done. Always turn things around. There's one of my favorite memes is every Russian accusation is a confession. I think this one is important to grasp for the audience. If don't trust anything until Russia denies it, right? It's like there's always the projection is and it's in this funny way. It's true. Is when Putin would say, "Oh, those revolutions were sponsored by the West, right? The Orange Revolution. It's a conspiracy. It's the CIA." Why is he saying those things? He genuinely believes it because that's how Russia is structured as a police state. That's his background. He's projecting. He cannot imagine the world where people have agency, where people stand up and say, "I have dignity. I'm a Ukrainian. I don't want to be living in a corrupt state where Yanukovych wants to sell my country to Russia. I don't want to do that. I have freedom and I have agency." Right? To Putin, incomprehensible. It just cannot be, because everything, they're puppeteers, and so in a sense, this projection is a summary of how that apparatus works, how people think.
That's so true. That's so true about like the use of like accusing your opponent of that which you are yourself guilty. That's always what they do, and you just see this all the time. You're so right that they cannot envision or imagine a people just standing up for themselves. So because they treat other countries like vassal states, because all of Eastern Europe is treated like a vassal state, they've been used to treating all of Eastern Europe as their vassals for 200, 300 years. They just must imagine that no country can have its own free will. Everyone has to be, it's either they're puppeteered by Russia or they're puppeteered by America. No country can have its own independent foreign policy. No country can be, independent in any way. It's just a world divided only by spheres of influence. I don't know. I'm interested, Andrew. Like, you worked in diplomacy for the American government. This is the big question that we're all asking. Is America under Trump going towards isolationism, or are they going towards a full, open, outright pro-Russia spheres of influence type world? And it seems sometimes it changes day by day. It's so hard to tell, because every day, like one day he's fully supportive of Russia. The next day he, destroys the world economy and the Russian oil price goes down and they're going to be bankrupted. It changes day by day. Like some days he's talking about, like just almost like retreating only to the Western Hemisphere. But then the next day, and he goes, they will say, oh, we just actually want Europe to stand up for it themselves. We are happy for a strong Europe. We want them to be able to watch their own backyard. And then yesterday we found out they wanted to block European countries from arming Ukraine. So then when we see that, we're like, no, they're not happy with a strong and independent Europe. They're not happy with a Europe that has any foreign policy whatsoever. When they try to block European countries from backing Ukraine, that's almost just straight, they're pro-Russia. So what do you think? Is it full isolationism? Are they retreating to the Western Hemisphere, or are they actually just full pro-Russia? It's hard to say.
Yeah, I have a few answers. One thing I wanted to note is, in that question, we're giving credit to current American administration, and in some sense, that's the power Trump is exercising. There's a brand new kind of power that has emerged, and it's not yet understood widely. I'm going to quote what I've learned from Ezra Klein on the question of human attention as a new source of power. Like if you go back, I don't know, 100 years, let's say, like the television, whatever, like there was a power of persuasion, right? You had hard power, economic power, soft power through culture and so on. But power to capture attention didn't exist because attention was not traded. It wasn't competed for in the way that the case is today. And then so in some sense, Trump is a manifestation of all kinds of things, of all kinds of dysfunction in society, the polarization. Another quote, I can't remember who came up with it. Trump is a wrong answer to the right questions. Like he's picking something that he can somehow becomes a manifestation of it, but then the answers are all wrong. So what I wanted to say is this idea of capturing attention as a source of power, as long as he's top of news, as long as agenda is set and everybody's scrambling trying to make sense of it, then the power is being exercised and we're being consumed by it. So in my writing or my tweets, I stopped using the name whatsoever. And same going to Russia. I don't want to talk about Putin. Circling back all the way around, we were talking about police state and inability for Putin to grant agency to anyone. But I think that's where you have to go all the way to the roots. The idea of free will within Russia. It's like, the West has dealt with the question of slavery, right? When slaves were owned, traded, bought, sold, Russians had the same thing. They were called, they were serfs, but they were local nationals. They weren't brought from Africa or elsewhere. They would just be serfs, and then they were liberated. But in that liberation, the imperial trajectory of Russia, it did, sign the act and so on, but the country hasn't changed. So the idea that people, when they gain that, de facto freedom, right, they were no longer owned by the landowners, but they have not gained agency, like the political agency or any kind of other, sense of freedom. The revolution didn't work that way. In the West, after the freedom was gained, it was over time converted into democracy, self-rule, and so on. And in Russia, it never really happened, even though there is, Soviet Union and so on.
Yeah, that's so true. Like, I mean, it wasn't really through a process of social struggle, I suppose. Like, it was literally the Tsar signed a decree, right?
Yeah, and then you had the Soviet Union, but that was another manifestation of the Russian Empire, was one man rule kind of thing, right? So this idea of agency and freedom and people acting for themselves, it's neither allowed by the power nor demanded from ground up in a way that that force eventually went somewhere. Because if it would have ever worked, we would have not had a unitary Russian Federation, because then people would have demanded power and then the empire would have to collapse. But it never really happened.
Even the way the Bolsheviks took power was through a coup. Like, it's different from other kind of like revolutions in history, because like they literally just seized power through a coup.
Yeah.
I have a theory. I want to test it on you guys. I think Russia is much stronger than Soviet Union because the state provides its citizens the things that they want, and they kind of, well, they don't need it, but they want it. So just let me explain what I mean. So in the Soviet Union, it was mostly like you had Soviet products, which were all shit. There was no really technology, no computers, and so on. But now, with modern Russia, it's kind of a clever system where you have all these luxury products. You have Italian brands, you have all these social media sites and so on, but you control the flow of information. So you don't let any information from outside into the information sphere, but you let goods in. You let like good food, good luxury items, I don't know, handbags, shoes, and so on. So people in these big cities, they remain happy. And with the colonies, well, they are colonies. What Russia offers to these people is basically wealth, money. You send your children to fight in Ukraine, you get a lot of money. You can actually have a better life. So my theory is that right now it's working really well for Russia. I think the biggest problem for there is the overheating of the war economy and so on, and basically them running out of workers. But I mean, how do you disagree, agree with this theory?
If I can suggest a first thought, Soviet Union had to build coherence around ideology. It was those countries came together, which, Russia colonized, Moscow colonized countries, and then told us, me growing up in Soviet Union, that we were all brothers and they were, in this union together because we chose. That lie was sold really well. And growing up, I'm like, oh, that sounds amazing. Aren't we, better than anyone else? But so you had to offer coherence to that Soviet Union as an entity through ideology, to say our system is more fair and their evil system, capitalists, are just, poor little children. They don't have enough to eat because the system is not trying to create equality or whatever. Now, Russia, I think, Pekka, you're pinning down something about the openness to the West, where it takes the things it wants, but then kind of fuels a system that exists. But there's another reason: is there's more coherence. It's there's a Ukrainian philosopher, Volodymyr Yermolenko, who explains this idea of colonization, the Russian style, through sameness, which is equally violent as colonization through saying, the Brits show up in India and say, we're gonna rule, you're gonna have to look up, and then so it's obvious who rules and who is being colonized. In Russian way of colonization, the Muscovites will show up in Siberia and say, you are us, start being us. It doesn't matter if you look different, it doesn't matter. Start speaking Russian, we treat you as Russian. But we basically take your identity, erase it, and you are now Russian. Accept it. If you don't like it, well, you have to then die. But those were your options. And this is the same story now in Ukraine. Like Putin announces that there is no Ukraine. He goes out and says, we're one people. Therefore, we will have to go and take that land, kill everybody who doesn't say they're Russian, and whoever is not dead will then have to speak Russian and say they are now Russian. But so you go look at this plot of land from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, and a lot of population replacement over time. Like even where I grew up, right? My roots are Armenian Jewish, so had nothing to do with Eastern Ukraine. So the land in Donbass was repopulated. The locals were exterminated through Holodomor, the forced famine, and then the idea under Stalin is, ship people over, just tell them like go, the jobs are there, let us just forcefully move populations. They've done the same with Crimea. Crimean Tatars being expelled, other people have to come in. Why is it Russian Crimea? Why people speak Russian? Because they send a bunch of Russians from other regions. And so because then you have this plot of land that we call Russia, and where they had a lot more time. They had century of trying to erase identities, where with Soviet Union, it was 70 years of trying to tell, Uzbeks and Moldovans that they're Russians, less time, right? So when that fell apart, some colonies that Moscow controlled kind of could revert back to identities that were there, latent identities, whereas inside Russia, it's this grinder has been going for longer. And then so people in Tatarstan, maybe they think they're Russian, not Tatars.
That's so interesting. The way they they have these forcible population transfers. Like you get some really, this is just like, it's interesting to me, right? Because like I'm Australian, I'm so far away from this, so far removed. But like I was reading the other day, like I discovered that there's like, I discovered that, oh sorry, my camera worked, but I discovered that there's like a substantial population of like Koreans in Uzbekistan. And like there are Korean Ukrainians and stuff like that. And I was interested. I was like, that's really interesting. Like, how did that come to be? And I learned like, like Stalin, took the Koreans that were, I guess, right in the Russian, the Far East. They were right on the border, I guess, of Korea. And they were in the far East that Russia controls. And he thought that they were a threat when they were there. So he deported them to like Central Asia, and some end up in Ukraine and stuff like that. I'm interested, Andrew. What was it like for you? You actually grew up in the Soviet Union. Like what was it like life in Eastern Ukraine in Soviet times as a kid? What was it like?
Yeah, no, it's my early memory is crying at the kindergarten because our dear leader died, and looking back, it must have been Brezhnev. Say it again.
Oh, Brezhnev! Wow.
Yeah. I'm old.
See, that's so interesting to me, though. Like, because like from the vantage point of today, Brezhnev is kind of like laughed at a bit, right? Like, because he's like, he was so old towards the end. He was getting senile. He had the other Soviet Politburo members, like, holding. He was like a half corpse at the end, right? And like, it's just amazing that like to think of him that he was actually a figure where there was a cult of personality a bit around him, and the kids were taught to cry over him. When we see him today as like, kind of like clownish figure, that's interesting.
But it tells you how the system functioned, right? It's not that anyone had to really feel sad that Brezhnev's dead. It's because if you elect your government in America, there's a saying that we hire them to drive the bus. So we, the people, as an American, I can say those things, like we hire them, and then if we don't like them, we throw them away. In Soviet Union, because it's the Russian Empire by another name, you have a czar, and czar died, so therefore we must be sad. It doesn't matter who czar is. It's like it's a it's a different entity, so therefore we need to be differential. But yeah, growing up, I was so convinced by the whole damn story, like. Because from outside, you look at communism and you think, it was such a cruel, evil thing, right? If you just being objective, let's go back to Stalin Hitler dichotomy, right? To an outsider, it's so obvious that those two were equally evil, terrible people. Stalin is murdering locals by thousands, sending them to gulags. Like Stalin caused as much death and destruction to Russian Soviet citizens as Hitler did. But so they co-start the war. They come together and say, we're ambitious colonizers. Let us colonize Poland together. So off they go, partition Poland. But then Russia ends up on the winning side by accident. It just ends up on that side because America steps in and so on. And Hitler is absolute evil, and Stalin is kind of evil. But in the Russian telling, all of it gets washed away. In the Soviet Union, we were told that Stalin was, had his had his problems with his gulags, but that's in my time. Now in Russia, it's been whitewashed more and more and more and more, and the problems are now much less prominent. So you don't have to reflect on the gulags. You don't have to, if you live in Russia, you don't have to worry about how many Russian people did the Russian Tsar named Stalin killed. So growing up, to me, the Soviet story was resonating. I wasn't a family of dissidents, and in a sense, Donbass was like a promised land. It's like a, Disneyland of Soviet Union, because it was this place where like Soviet mentality got locked. Even like why was it invaded? It's a time capsule of Soviet Union. I left Ukraine in '98, and Kiev, Lviv, other towns, they were reclaiming Ukrainian identity, building a nation, whereas Donetsk was stuck in time. Like it was, Ukrainian culture was finding, like the green shoots were picking up, but it was still Russian speaking. It was really a lost place because, again, of that repopulation efforts. But yeah, so it's hard to describe the experience of saying, growing up in the socialist world, or learning about communism and Lenin, a prophet. It's like communism is in its own way a religion, because religion was banned. Like there was this whole thing that Russia is a right wing paradise because it's so religious. It's such BS. Like it's so disconnected from anything. Like Putin and people of his age, especially coming from KGB, religion never mattered. It didn't exist in that time. It was banished, and then so communism was religion.
It's so just on that point of the fantasy of Russia as this right-wing Christian traditionalist paradise that they've really built up to particularly target American right-wingers, right? I read the other day, and I think this is a new story. I'm not sure. Maybe Pekka, you've probably heard it. You could probably tell me if it's new or not. But I read there was a man who burned the Quran in Russia, and look, I'm against Quran burning. I think it's a vulgar act, etc. But the response of the state was hideous. So they actually, apparently, they took him and they transported him to Chechnya. This guy, and it was at the request of the Chechen authorities. And I believe that what happened was Kadyrov's son personally tortured him and beat him in the jails. And then he's now been sentenced to like 13 and a half years in prison. And it's just so interesting, right? Because like there's all the right wingers who talk about, Russia, the traditionalist Christian paradise, but like they just literally transported this guy to Chechnya to be tortured by, like these pretty hardcore radical religious extremists. And it's like just incredible, right? I don't know. Did you hear that story, Pekka, recently?
Which one? Sorry, I had to play with my headphones.
No worries about that. There was the guy, I think he's Russian, and he was he did a Quran burning. And I just said before, like I think Quran burning's vulgar. I don't like it. But he was basically like abducted by the state. They transported him to Chechnya because the Kadyrov, I think Kadyrov or his son made a direct request that he be transported to Chechnya from like Moscow or something. And then Kadyrov's son literally personally tortured him and like beat him in jails, and is now being given 13 and a half years in prison. And it's like, Like it just goes so far against, you know, the right wing narrative of Russia as the Christian paradise and Putin's the Christian leader who is so divinely inspired by orthodoxy and stuff like that. Like they're transferring this guy to be tortured by extremists in Chechnya. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, I have 2 points. I've heard the story. I don't really know the details, but okay. The first story is that President Zelensky actually had to apologize to Kadyrov because of some jokes he did a long time ago.
Oh, like
This was
like
in Michael Zygar's book. Don't remember the name, but the latest book. It's a really good book, even if the author is Russian. But he's one of the good ones.
so this
But
is like
anyway, another story.
yeah,
Just want to make like a clear connection here that for a while I think Chechnya has been this kind of prison planet for the Russians. So if you do something really bad, you are sent to Chechnya, and a lot of bad things will happen. Of course, all of the Russian prisons are probably like this, but Chechnya is probably the worst one of those. And then if you look at what's happening between the US and El Salvador right now, they are kind of creating their own Chechnya there, because anybody could be sent to Salvadorian prison, and you know what's going to happen to them, because these mega prisons are ruled by gangs, and they're basically lawless mini states inside El Salvador. So I think this is something that the Americans might be creating in a Central American state right now.
Bukele as Trump's Kadyrov. That's crazy to think about. Damn, that's
But
interesting.
Andrew, I have a question for you. So all this Stalin deportations and like transfer of populations. So now I think around 28% at least of population in Latvia speaks Russian. I don't know the percentage in Estonia and Lithuania, but it's remarkable. There's quite a few. Um, do you think that this could be used as a motivation or like a kind of casus belli for another special operation in the Baltics?
It's yeah. I in one of my articles I use this unhumorous joke. If you continue to speak Russian wherever you are in the world, you know, Putin or the next czar will come to save you. So I grew up speaking Russian. I spoke nothing else until age of 20. I could not form a sentence in English until that age. And you know, I've not heard Ukrainian growing up. It was nowhere near me. But now, as of 2-3 years, I don't speak Russian. I speak Ukrainian at home. I speak Ukrainian to my Ukrainian friends, or English, but I don't want to use that language. And so, so you think about this, you know, who's done the most to antagonize Russian speakers of Russian culture? It's Putin, right, in Ukraine. But Pekka, you're right to raise this question of what does that mean if you have Russian-speaking enclaves or population centers? It's absolutely could be used and will be used by Russia in one way or another. It's a question of testing boundaries. You know, if Article 5 was bulletproof for a long time, now if there are doubts, there will be like. So one of the arguments I make is the World War III is coming. The only thing standing in its way is Ukraine's bravery. The Ukraine is holding the door. The World War III will unroll, absolutely 100% certainty. It will push on, and there are multiple factors. You brought it up early, Pekka, saying that you know, Russian economy is geared towards military now. So you know who is the biggest threat to Putin's power? Is Russian fighters coming back. It's not obvious to a lot of folks who don't think about it. If you have, you know, 500,000 or whatever under arms, and suddenly, let's say, ceasefire, end the war, done, you know, then they come home. Who's going to pay them the same money? What are they going to do? It's been part of Russian history. Even the Bolshevik Revolution had to do with mutiny, had to do with sailors or whoever rebelling, and like they're a huge risk. And then how do you gear up economy towards other things? If Russia is under sanctions, it has no future vision. It never cared for its population. So you cannot, if they're not going anywhere, how do you then stop going towards war? I The more I think of how that place functions, Russia, Moscow needs to justify its existence. It needs to justify the whole system to itself all the time. It needs to prove to the Russian people that there are 140 million or whatever the number is. They need to all bow to the Kremlin. Why is that? And so, because they extract resources, they take everybody's freedom. They meaning Moscovia, that stretches all the way to Vladivostok. But that's the system, right? So how do you justify it? Are you going to offer good things to the people, or you buy them from the West and pacify your elites? But what do you offer to the people? Or you offer greatness, the conquest. You offer raising from the knees and whatever. So that's the thing, and that's where legitimacy comes from. It's stop invading. Where is the legitimacy? Like, what are you going to do? So that's factor number one. Factor number two, if the thesis is Ukraine is holding the door, right? Ukraine's bravery is what's keeping World War III from coming to Europe. Let's say the door is no longer held, like Ukraine, quote unquote, is now no longer fighting. Russians are mobilizing people in Crimea to go fight Ukrainians, mobilizing people in my hometown. Like what, in 2014 when Donetsk was invaded, somebody who was 10 years old then is now 24 years old, or yes, 21, right? Uh, so then what? Like they've been fed all those lies. They've been told they're Russians and they're Nazis in Kiev and so on. And those kids are now, off you go. Here's your Kalashnikov. They're either dead or fighting. Who knows? But then Ukraine has the second biggest army on the continent, on European continent. So if that army is now under Russian control, what is going to happen? And if Ukraine is betrayed in this way, because West has all the power, Europe has plenty of power. America, even if America disassociates from the whole thing, Europe has plenty of power to stop Putin. And if Europe is choosing not to, because that's what it looks like, and Ukrainians fight, and they exhaust themselves, who, of course, Russia is the enemy, but if Ukrainians feel betrayed and now Ukraine is run by Russia, what's going to happen next? It's so obvious. Like, and those enclaves will be the first places, but it won't stop there.
How would Europe stop Russia? What would need to be done?
There's, number one of all is abandon this awful, terrible mantra of with Ukraine as long as it takes. Europe will do nothing until it's declared Russia must be defeated in Ukraine. Ukraine borders must be restored. Until this is announced, I think Merz said something to this tune. Like, you have to declare what we're doing, because without, so this terrible flip, I really am so upset by this framing, as long as it takes, because that's why things are not going anywhere. Because we don't, no, it's just, it's what we're here to do is help Ukraine to not win and to not lose. And it's just making things worse every single day for Europe. The risk keeps going up, but we are, pretending like, how kids can close your eyes and suddenly you're not there. It's like, no, if we say borders need to be respected, the reason Russians are fighting in Ukraine is because we sneezed through Georgia, we sneezed through Crimea, because the idea that borders matter stop existing, because Europe done nothing to say borders are sacred. Russia, you signed the treaty. Those borders you in Moscow accepted, and now you're violating them, and we're looking away. We Europeans, we can't do it. This often quoted tweet. 500 million Europeans calling up 300 million Americans, trying to help them, deal with the 100 million Russians who are now effectively being deterred by 30 million Ukrainians. Like, what is this nonsense? Like, Europe has economy 20 times for every Russian unit of economy. Europe has 20. Like, we just have to say, we will do what it takes for Ukraine to expel Russia. If this announcement is made, Russia will start leaving and Russia will start declaring victory. If we simply say we're serious, then that's it. Like, send Taurus missiles, seize assets. But all of those things are downstream from making it clear what our goal is. Defeat Russia in Ukraine, send them back. No one needs to march on Moscow, but the invaders need to be expelled and borders need to be restored. If we don't say it, things go get increasingly worse over time.
Do you think, Andrew, like what do you think the best case scenario right now is? Like if we could empower Europe right now to do what we're talking about, what's the best case scenario?
If we go from realism and say what everybody's hoping for in every European capital is a fudge, is everybody's dream, is a fudge. Let's hope this goes away. Let's hope it solves itself. So what's realistic? Everybody is hoping that this Trump diplomacy will yield something. There'll be some kind of ceasefire or whatever, and maybe it'll just all stop. that won't happen, right? So realistic scenario, maybe there is some kind of freezing of the line, but that changes nothing over time. Like, if we think of weeks and months, maybe it matters. But if we think in kind of trajectory, if Russia is not expelled, Russia won, right?
Yeah.
If Russia walks away with anything resembling a victory, what does that mean? Is we escalated the conflict. We, Europe, US, we've let Russian appetite for war to escalate. So our escalation management, we escalated by letting them think that they gained. So if they gain from aggression, they'll do it again.
That's so true. That's so true. Like, see, that's the thing. Like, it's actually almost worse if you half do it, right? Because when you only half resist, it teaches them that if they just keep pushing it, they'll win. It's the thing. Have you ever? I'm interested, Andrew. Have you ever like read Svetlana Alexievich?
I've read her book. Excellent book. Recommended too.
Yeah, amazing book. Like, have you read Boys in Zinc by any chance?
No.
Oh, so I read Secondhand Time, which is like such a good book, and that like taught me a lot about like just Russian culture, like how deep the violence and authoritarianism is baked in. It's really grim. If you read that book, it's just so grim. I read Boys in Zinc, which is all about like the Afghan war and the veterans who return home. And this is just coming back to what you're talking about, how like, imagine the social consequences of 500,000, 600,000 Russians returning. Like, in Afghanistan, like this book, Boys in Ink, it was Boys in Zinc. It was talking about how, like, by comparison, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, the amount of Russian men who went over there, like by comparison, it's actually nothing compared to Ukraine, right? And like this book talks so much about how, just the social consequences of that war. All the men who came back who, like, they had no, like half of them had no, like, the guys who come back with no limbs, they're bitter, they're alcoholics, they're hooked on hard drugs, the anger in the society. And like, this is the scary thing, right? Like, this is like, Afghanistan's nothing compared to Ukraine now, right? Like, this book was kind of, it kind of almost explains to you in a way that, like, it did play a role in, like, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like, these guys coming back, like the social trauma of Afghanistan for Soviet Union played a big role in the collapse. And like, the scary thing is, like, Ukraine is another level. It's like many levels more, the depth of their involvement, because if the social consequences of, losing maybe 15 to 20,000 men in Afghanistan, and you have all these veterans coming back, like, that in itself was so destabilizing and such a shock for Russian society and the Soviet Union. But to then have 500,000 come back, and they've already probably lost 500,000 men, and to have, like, it's actually really scary to think about. So that's the scary thing. Like, I think people don't realize this, and as you said this exactly, and Pekka said this too, like, everything is on Putin to continue the war, because, like, to stop it now, with the way that he's reconfigured Russian society, like the massive shift of the economy towards the war capacity, like the fact that it seems like the only way he's kept this entire society together through this massive shock wave, right, is just by paying out these massive bonuses when you join up, and the massive soldier salaries, but also the massive, payments to the. I mean, it's crazy because in Western terms, this is really not huge money, but like in terms of, really poor Siberian towns and stuff like that, the money they're paying out to the families. I read a statistic somewhere that said it can actually almost be better for a working age man in, Siberia to join up, die. It's better for his family to take that money than for him to just keep working for the rest of his life. Because like in terms of the payment that goes to the family, it's more than he could be expected to make in the rest of his entire working life. So this is the crazy thing, right? Like it's held together by a thread, these massive transfers. And I guess that's all coming really from the oil wealth and stuff like that. But oh my God, like what's going to happen to this society at the end? Like it's scary. It's really scary to think about. I recently read, like a book about the rise of Mussolini and fascist Italy and stuff like that. And it was really making clear, like a massive, like just huge part of it was all these veterans coming back from World War I, and they're all bitter, they're angry. There's just like a whole generation of traumatized men. And that's literally what brings fascism in Italy and fascism in Germany and stuff like that. But the scary thing is like the same dynamic now exists in Russia. I think it's already a fascist society, but like it could get worse. It's just the whole thing's so scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a side note on that. There is now a whole new system of making money in Russia. Is these 30-something Russian ladies with the, those lips, looking for soldiers who are enlisting for the army. They go fight in Ukraine, they die, and these ladies get the money. So I saw this video. I think it was a Russian podcast or something. This lady was talking like it's a good system. Like you can earn a lot of money by doing this. Marry a guy, he goes to fight in Ukraine, he dies most probably, and you get a lot of money. So this is like the level of decadence that you have in modern Russia, and it's just, to me, it's just absolutely disgusting.
Gee, this goes back as well, Andrew. I'm interested because the way you were talking about it, it certainly seems to be the case. Like you're certainly of the sort of school of thought that it's like it's not just Putin. Like this is the problem. Really, is Russian culture and stuff like that. Yeah, could you go into that a bit more? Because like I think you're right there. It's a really grim point to talk about. But
it's such an important one, though. It's so I was reading yesterday Francisca Davis' review of a Russian opposition leader speaking in Paris, and I think she used this particular phrasing that I've not come across, is reclaim Russian innocence. So by blaming Putin, you claim innocence for the society. But Putin is a manifestation of Russian culture. He's not an aberration. He's not an exception. How do we know that Putin is not unique? We just look at the damn history, every single one. Like Russia, whatever wars it fought, a minuscule percentage of them were defensive wars. It invades every single member, every single chance it gets. It always happens. It's happening now. Nothing is different. So why? So Russian society is so much easier to say it's evil Putin. He's doing all of this. First of all, it's factually easy to prove. Right? He's not pulling every trigger. He's not guiding every missile. But also to say that there's this evil state took over and made Russians do bad things. But where did he come from? Who imposed Putin on Russian society? We go back to this question of freedom and agency. But this gets you to also status of accomplice, right? If society says, oh, by being apolitical, because that's a very popular phrase in Moscow, я вне политики, I'm outside of politics. I just live my life. And this powerful people, they're doing their things, but it doesn't concern me. Well, go back to the phrase from Hitler, right? First they came for the Jews, then communists, and so on. Like, yeah, if you are outside of politics, you're not excused. There's so many million Russians. they carry responsibility. I think we need to distinguish guilt and responsibility, right? Guilt, if people are committing war crimes, they're guilty of war crimes. If they're, advocating genocide on TV, they're guilty.
Yeah.
But the responsibility stretches all the way. Every single Russian who is not publicly opposing the war, not doing something to stop it, is responsible because the war is done in their name. And this, but it's beyond. It's not simply basics of responsibility. It's the culture itself, because Russia is not a country. There's no nation. It's an empire through and through. I was making the argument is being a Russian person and not an imperialist is impossible, because Russia itself is not a country; it's an empire. So if somebody says I'm a Russian, this opposition leader who spoke in Paris, he's a Russian. He's out there. So therefore, he needs to say things that are imperialist through and through. He cannot not say them, because then he will have to stop being Russian. He has to be something else. He needs to be anti-imperialist or whatever, and then he needs to. He just cannot be both. So it's it's a complicated thought, but a lot stems from it. Is why is Russia invading? Because it's an empire. Empire can only exist if it invades and colonizes. As soon as it stops, it collapses. Well, so then these are the avenues, go towards collapse or start invading. So it's invading. So it needs a gift of defeat, is what I keep saying. The gift of defeat is what Russia needs the most.
I'm interested, Andrew. Could I ask you one quick question? So I know, Pekka, you were about to say something. I just wanted to ask though, like you describe yourself, you grew up, you spoke Russian as your main language until you were 20, and you grew up in the Donbass, you grew up in the Soviet Union. I guess as a kid, I guess you wouldn't have really been taught that you were Ukrainian, right? I mean, you were taught you were Soviet, etc. I'm interested, like, how did you come to break out of that mentality? How did you come to start thinking of yourself as not just not Soviet, not part of the Ruski Mir? How did that change for you? I'm interested.
Yeah, I was lucky. Maybe I'll make this quick, and then we'll go to Pekka. But I was very lucky. I got out in '98. I moved to America, and this the mind gaslighting. It's so tricky. Like a lot of my friends in the U.S. would be Russian speakers. Like if I hear somebody in America speak Russian, I'd be like, oh my gosh, my kin, let's talk. But the more you learn, the more you are the brainwashing, like the environment in which you exist has changed, and so accepting the actual historical truth is difficult because it conflicts with who you are, not just what you know, but who you think you are. And so decades. I'm lucky. That's the only answer. If I never left Ukraine, I don't want to even speculate, but folks who are me in that town who haven't left, I don't know where they are. Maybe they're cheering Putin. Maybe they're out there with Kalashnikovs. I don't know. It's just crazy to even contemplate.
That's a scary thought. Sorry, Pekka, you go. That's really interesting though. That's fucking scary.
Yeah, definitely interesting. I think this is somewhat related. I think what I would just wanted to add to the previous comments that Putin he is popular in Russia. He is still very popular. He's not 87% popular, but it's always 87%. I mean, Lukashenko copied the same result. I don't know how do they come up with these numbers. Maybe just throw a dice. But I mean, he is popular. And the thing is, there's a time period called Shmuta. I don't know if maybe I mispronounced the word, but there was like 400 years ago, there was Shmuta, time of troubles in Russia. And this was for a long time, and still probably considered to be the worst time in Russian history because they had a weak leader. They really did. They had a lot of like people who wanted to be the emperor or whatever. There was a lot of infighting in leadership. There was a famine. It was a very bad time for Russia, Imperial Russia. And then the beginning of 90s is some refer to it as the second Shmuta time of troubles, because they tried democracy. They had to rely on the US. It was the weak period of Russia. And then Putin kind of came and saved the Russian Empire by becoming the strong leader. So Russia has always preferred these strong leaders, the Tsar, who's never wrong, and then you have the boyars and princes and so on, this kind of hierarchy. But the Tsar is always needs to be strong, and that's why also Putin is so popular. And it's the war is not really it's nothing new to Russians. There's always war somewhere. There's always some operation, special operation going on, and it's actually good for the Russian society because it's an empire and it works that way. I don't know, maybe you disagree, but that's the way I see it.
It's absolutely right. It's back to this justifying the Moscow-centered entity. I call it, instead of Russia, my keyboard on the phone, I start typing Moscow dash, and it finishes this for me. Moscow-centered terrorist organization. That's what, to me, Russia is. It's not. If you call it Russia, you give it a meaning. You say it's that plot of land. It must be a country because we see it on the map. It's a country. It looks this way, but it's this Moscow-centered terror enterprise, and it doesn't matter again who is in charge. And yeah, it's Putin did not create the Russian people. The Russian people created Putin. It's key. And you asked me early on about the big Russian lie. There's one thing that I find myself trying to argue in very precise terms. If you say Russian culture is a culture of genocide, there'll be Vatniks showing up in the comments and saying that I'm a racist, that I
Russophobe.
Russian specifically. There's something I'm pigeonholing, and it's a DNA problem. No, it's a critique of sick society. It's not. Nothing's wrong with a person who is born to Russian parents. No, it's just the way that society is organized. There are no citizens in Russia. They're inhabitants, because citizenship requires responsibilities and rights, right? So you cannot have rights without responsibilities. So because they're inhabitants, because that culture is okay, with this dreams of greatness, as long as So Russians don't oppose the war; they oppose dying in that war, or fighting in this unjust. But opposing the war, oh, that, like, do I care? It's like that's the paradox. There's so much that's wrong with how that whole place is organized, and as soon as we say it's Putin's war, or we say it's he's just that evil guy who's making all of this happen, and if only he was gone, like, it's almost like, to people who are pro-Ukraine, if you say, if you could do one thing, what would you do? It's like, oh, just kill that damn Putin and things just get better, and then the whole thing stops. No, nothing changes.
Yeah. I know you've got to leave really quick. Can I ask you really quickly, like, this is actually a pretty controversial one. I'm interested in your thoughts too, Pekka. Like the question of Navalny, right? Like, because I know, like, people have been really against his family because they felt that, like, when they went to the Academy Awards, etc., like, they didn't properly talk about Ukraine. He obviously had the history of ultranationalist comments when he was a younger leader, and I know he'd never formally kind of repudiated that. So I know there are a lot of people in the Ukraine camp and stuff who are like quite anti-Navalny, and there are some people who argue, like, if Navalny was in charge, it'd still be the same thing. I'm interested, Andrew and Pekka. What do you think?
Pekka, you go first.
It's a tough one. I know it's a tough one. I'm sorry, Brian.
Yeah, I try to be brief. I know we have to wrap up. This will be the wrap up. Actually, we can continue from here the next time. So for me, Navalny, I think he was an opposition figure who looked like the country, or the whatever you want to call it, terrorist organization. He was popular because he was flirting with the ultranationalists. He was flirting with far right. He was popular because of that. He was Russian through and through. That's why he was popular. But I think what he did was quite, like, his work was important for the West, just to show the level of corruption in Russia. But I think he was just an opposition figure who looked like the country. So he was very Russian in that sense. And I understand completely why, for example, Ukrainians dislike him, Georgians dislike him. A lot of his statements, like the sandwich thing, that you cannot just keep switching Crimea like sandwich and calling Georgians cockroaches, and this is just bad, of course. But he was a true Russian opposition figure who looked like a Russian opposition figure.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
interested.
I'm of two minds generally. Is like if I put myself in saying we're advocating for Ukraine, we want better things for Ukraine. So anybody who opposes Putin and willing, like who's brave enough, right? He went to the like if you take even Karamurza, this guy was risking his life. Like he went back because he's has certain beliefs, and so you can admire personal bravery
And
and if, yeah, and same with Navalny. Like, but what we need to keep separating is
Yeah.
there. I think Pekka is nailed it. Is they're operating within the same OS, right? Their
yeah,
imperial mindset cannot be separated from a Russian. If and it's, so imagine like if anybody who says I want something better for that place will be an anathema because that person would say we need to devolve power and over time the damn thing has to fall apart. Moscow cannot milk Siberia, create all the billionaires who will then put pressure on everybody else and say bow to the czar, the system stays. That system is cruel and colonial, and so anyone who is within it who needs to perpetuate it therefore inherits all this baggage. But if you oppose it, then you cannot be popular. Then you have to be a person advocating for the disintegration of that place, and then you cannot be a Russian leader. It's there's a lot of contradictions in it. But with his family specifically, I don't think anyone should come after anybody unless they're saying stupid things or doing stupid things.
yeah,
So Navalny, in her arguments, she's advocating for lifting of sanctions. His, so she as a person is saying stupid things, and we need to focus on that, not who she is or is her
yeah,
husband right or wrong. Like no, like let's judge people on their merits.
yeah.
Yeah, focus on the stupidity. Okay, let's wrap up here. Thanks,
Awesome.
Andrew. Thanks, Drew. I think we can still. I want to hear Drew about your thoughts on Navalny in the next episode. We
Yeah,
can continue this there.
yeah.
And we have to do this again, Andrew. Let's wrap it up here. I thank you first of all, and thanks for a great episode. I know you have to go, so we'll end here.